Thank you all for having me. As Larry said, I drove from Detroit last night, which sounds, like who cares? That's not that big of a deal. Except when you live in Minneapolis, it's quite a deal. So I'm here. I'm really happy to be here, and really looking forward to the conversation we'll have. So I have one big question that I want us to at least focus on today, and we may have it bleed into tomorrow as well. We'll see how we go. But our big question really is a why question, and this is it. Why does it just feel so hard to be a pastor right now? Or why does it just feel so hard, congregational life? Like, why is congregational life so hard? So I'm just going to answer it right off the bat. And the reason I think that it's so hard is because of the secular. So thank you. I know some of you, came a long way to be here, but that's it. We're done. Tip your waiter, and yeah, thanks for being here. All right, so here's the problem. As soon as you say the issue with your denomination or your congregation or America or whatever you say, the issue is the secular. It just takes a little bit of conversation to realize that when you're talking to someone about this, you don't really mean the same thing they do. There's a certain sense where you're on the same page, there's a lot of overlap, and then things come up and you're like, well, I'm not sure I quite mean it like that. Now, we're not going to do this, so don't freak out. But if I passed around note cards and had you write your definition of the secular on it, and then we took those in and we, looked at those, and then we put big white newsprint on the wall, and we looked at everyone's different definition of the secular, there would be overlap. There would be a lot of overlap. But there also would be a good amount of difference. We would see difference within that. So what I want to do with our time is unfold this, and obviously stop, have some conversation along the way, but really look at what do we mean when we say it's very hard to do ministry in a secular age. What do we mean by that? And I think it's really important we get clear on what we mean by that word, because if we don't, some of the issues we think are the problem, and we try to go and solve those problems, may actually make things worse if we don't diagnose this the right way. All right, now this is a weird way to start. I was going to start with the whole Ewok war, but that's been done now, so I'm not exactly sure what to do. So I do have a video for you, a video clip that we're just going to start this way. It's a little bit of a weird way to start, but it's an interesting video, and it's going to get you talking, I think, about some interesting things in your group. So this is about a 6-minute video. It's an interview from the PBS NewsHour. It's like the end of the show. If you watch the PBS NewsHour, they do their little arts or books section at the end. And there's a woman who's just written a book, and because I didn't sleep last night, I can barely remember her name, but it's Wendy something, Wendy Russell. And she's written this book called Relax, It's Just God. How to Talk to Your Kids About God When You Don't Believe in God. So this is an interview, 6 minutes. I just want you to watch it and, what bounces out to you? What do you find interesting? Now, I do have to give you a caveat here. I want you to watch this video as an anthropologist. So not maybe as a moralist or maybe not even as a theologian. I just want you to give her the benefit of the doubt. I actually think she's a very intelligent person, but some of the things she says are really interesting. And I don't think she's an outlier. I think she is articulating something that's in the ether, that's in the air, that people breathe. So again, if you find her really annoying, just give her the benefit of the doubt. If you feel like you want to run in to defend her, just let it sit. But what strikes you in this interview?
Raising children is a journey generously sprinkled with what many view as teachable moments, perhaps none as challenging as those surrounding faith and religion. Author, journalist, and NewsHour online parenting columnist Wendy Thomas Russell comes at this from a different angle in her new book, Relax, It's Just God. How and why to talk to your kids about religion when you're not religious. She recently talked with Jeffrey Brown and explained how the book came to be.
I was in the car and my daughter announced to me that God had made her and that God had in fact made all children and all people. And
you thought?
And I was so, she was so incredulous because she just thought, this seems like really big news. And how you don't know it, Mommy, is really beyond me. So, but it struck me. I mean, I was really caught off guard by it. And
what did you say to her?
I didn't say much at the time. I sort of stumbled through the conversation, oh, who is God? And, I sort of stumbled through the conversation, and then later went home and talked to my husband, and he said, it's not what Maxine believes, but what she does in life that matters. And it was a turning point for me, this idea that if we raise kids to be moral and ethical and kind and generous, then what they believe is secondary. And it's been a guiding force through the book.
I want to ask you about the title. For so many people, God and their religion are a basic component of who they are. It's not just God.
Right.
And yet you use that, just God, relax. It's
Right.
just God.
Right.
What do you mean?
I don't mean to be flippant or insensitive in any way, but it does seem like there are certain topics that are hard for parents to talk about and to broach with their children. And increasingly, religion is becoming one of them. And in a lot of secular families, the word God is almost replacing sex as a kind of this taboo subject. So
The hard discussion that parents might have.
Yes. What I was getting at was that if it's not such a difficult subject if you approach it in the right way. And so we can all sort of lighten up.
You're coming at this as a secular, non-religious parent.
Correct.
You see a growing need for this
I
kind
do.
of discussion.
Religion isn't going anywhere. Religion is going to be around for a very long time. But it's true that secularism is on the rise, and it's growing rapidly, and it's grown in the last 20 years. The problem with a lot of parents in this particular group is that they are trying to raise their kids in this era of transition or this era of change. So let's come up with a way that we can talk to our kids about religion that's completely honest, that values critical thinking, that values religious tolerance and literacy, and that kind of leaves the door for kids to really make up their own minds.
Give me an example of a common dilemma that parents find when it comes to raising their children vis-a-vis religion.
There are quite a few, and I did a survey of 1,000 non-religious parents to find out exactly that. And the top reason cited was people weren't sure how to talk about religion without indoctrinating their kids into what they believed themselves. That was a hard line. The other one was interacting with religious family members and keeping the peace in families. When you're raising a child who is in a secular household, how do you bridge the gap between the older generations who may be more rigidly religious?
This word indoctrinating is an important one because it comes up time and again here. What's the difference between indoctrinating and guiding children, right?
Indoctrination I see as almost the antithesis of critical thinking. Of course, it's fine to guide your children, but I see indoctrination as sort of this middle ground between, full-on brainwashing and guidance. It's stronger than just merely guidance. I see indoctrination as telling children that there's only one way to believe, and that all other ways and people who believe all other things are less worthy of our respect, less intelligent, less moral. That's the crucial issue, because I think that when you do that, you set up your child to be bigoted against those who don't believe the way that you do. It's not a black and white world.
Well, so give me the example of the most basic question of your child says, "Mommy, does God exist? And what is God, or who is God?"
The way that I go about it is to say, that's a great question, and I'm glad you're thinking about it. That there are a lot of different ways that people describe God and describe what God is, and this is what some people believe, and this is what other people believe, and I don't believe in God, but that's okay. It's all okay, and you get to make up your own mind about what to believe.
Isn't that kind of mushy? Isn't it the job of a parent to guide, I'll use the word guide again, their child to say, well, no, it's not just this, it could be this, it could be that, whatever you think, whatever goes.
Right, well, I think within reason, and I see a difference between guiding your child to be a moral person, an ethical person, a self-respecting person, a critical thinker. Those are all really important things. Guiding them to believe in a certain way, in a certain God or a certain prophet, that is not so important. I really want to focus on what people do in life and not what they believe, because if we can judge people on their actions and not what we think the reasons behind their actions are, it makes for a more tolerant world and a better world.
All right, the book is Relax, It's Just God. Wendy Thomas Russell, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff.
It is a really fascinating thing where she is deeply, deeply frightened and actually thinks to impose any belief on her child will indoctrinate her, or there's just such a fine line between that. So she, you get to believe whatever you want to believe, and it is a huge question about what it means to be a human being, like in the sense of, can you not? Well, I mean, Jeffrey Brown wonders, well, what's the difference between forming and indoctrinating, and how do we do that? But this is a big worry for her, is that she'll indoctrinate her child. That seems to be a very high moral, out of bounds assertion, that you might indoctrinate someone. Yeah, good point. Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think if she was here, and again, I mean, first of all, we should say, I'm sure she's a better parent than I am. I mean, I'm sure she's a better parent than me. And she's a very smart person. And I think if she was sitting here, she would say, of course I'm trying to form my child. Of course I tell my child what's right and what's wrong. And yeah, so it is a very interesting thing how this openness plays with these certain moral particularities within this. I mean, it's an interesting negotiation, yeah. But she's very, very convinced that it is possible to disconnect what you do and what you believe. That's fundamentally what she holds to. And I think we are going to see this is very much a legacy of the West and how the West kind of functions. It wasn't always part of the Western imagination, but it is now, and it becomes a globalized kind of reality as this occurs. But she's very, very convinced that you can separate. She says it at the beginning of the video, and she says it at the end of the video. And what I want to say is, we give her the benefit of the doubt, is I bet the NewsHour had no one write in. Well, nowadays everyone writes in to complain about something. So maybe they were writing in to complain about something. But I don't think there are many people sitting at home going, what? That's the strangest thing I've ever heard. Like, most people in their day-to-day lives think, oh, that, of course. Of course, it doesn't really matter what you believe, it matters what you do. And these two things can be disconnected. And this is the story I want to tell you as we go on today. How could that happen? How could we come to an imagination where most people listen to her say, it's not what my daughter believes that matters, it's what she does that matters. That just doesn't occur. That's a construction. That's an assertion on how the world functions and how we think about who we are and how we think about who God is. So absolutely, there's a sense of a kind of Western middle class reality here. There's also a kind of sense of a coastal elite kind of perspective at play here. And I think you will find even more as you're with, we're drawing very ideal types here, but on the coast, this makes even more sense than it does in the middle of America, of course, so that we want to give our kid, part of my job as a parent, and this is not her saying, just figure it out for yourself. No, she's probably going to send her daughter to religious pluralism camp and, like, have a tutor maybe to look at all of this stuff. It's not without effort and without a sense of forming. She doesn't see that as indoctrination, which someone else might be like, what's the difference between that and a Sunday school class, But she does kind of think that she wants her daughter to be ethical, absolutely an ethical person. She's not so sure it matters what she believes within that, which is a whole different conception of what she thinks belief is in itself. Maybe it's some kind of propositions of a list of things you hold to. That's a really fascinating way that she articulates that. My sense is that they are absolutely just as nervous. And I think most of our people in our churches, I think across from the main line to evangelicals, for the most part, I think we operate, whether we would say it like this, we also kind of operate of a divide between what we believe and what we do. And we don't really want to be indoctrinating our kids either. I think that it's very possible that most people would say, well, no, there is something more about forming, and Sunday school is really important to me, or I remember my grandmother doing these things for me, and those practices in themselves would kind of break loose a little bit of thinking of it as a firm indoctrination. Like part of it is probably, now we're psychoanalyzing Wendy, and I really don't want to do that, but probably part of her story is either absolutely no engagement with any kind of religious community or a really negative one. And those seem to really be very mobilizing. So either she doesn't know what it's really like to have your grandmother pray for you or to watch your grandfather read his Bible. She's not really sure what that means to be in a community of people who are struggling and living together. Or else she was in a perspective where, she was hammered in one way or another to believe a certain thing. So I would say most parents, I don't think the inverse is necessarily true. But I think she would say, okay, that's fine, that's probably true, but isn't it dangerous? Isn't it potentially dangerous to kids? Isn't it maybe dangerous for society if we try to put together again what you believe and what you do? I think it's interesting that could be an anxiety within modern people. It is a question of how we negotiate, how we think about freedom, and what we think about what happens in a civic square, what it means to have people be able to articulate. As we go towards the end here, we're going to we saw this with the campus pastor. Like, what does it really mean to live an authentic life? How do we think about that morally? So yeah, it is not to, again, this is why I want us to be more anthropologists than making judgments about it. There are legitimate historical realities to point to and say, gosh, people have justified some really bad things purely on what they believe. And I think we all deal with this in pastoral ministry. How do you negotiate when someone says, God told me to? And you're like, you're, in some sense, this is all like preamble, and you're going to get really annoyed here, but we'll take a break and we're going to start building the story. But this is part of, I think, where you get stuck as a pastor. Potentially a pastor who still wants to hold on to a deep commitment that God acts and moves within the world. But then when someone says to you, God has acted and moved in the world and wants me to do X or Y, and then you're stuck with, or you're struck by, is this God or is this not God? Like God has told me to sell everything I own and go live on the streets. And you think, oh my gosh, you have an 8-year-old and you have health insurance now. I don't know if you should do, like, how do you help people make that, discern that? So we all get kind of stuck in that. And as a pastor, you have to help people negotiate that and discern that. Discernment becomes a big issue. And I think in some ways, Protestant pastors can become almost as more skeptical than their people. It's like, let's not do anything dangerous here. Dangerous maybe individually to their own upward mobility or something like that. But all to get back to your point, there are, of course, examples of people who said, God told me to do this, so I got a gun and did that. And it was because I believed this, or because I read this in the Bible that I did that. I mean, these become dangerous realities. And in some sense, that's why she wants her daughter just to be a good kid and not worry about what she believes, because what you believe could be very dangerous. But of course, the other side of this is you can't really do anything as a human being without believing something. Like this is what philosophers for the last 40 years have said. We are moral believing animals. We are the creatures who believe something. All of our actions are formed by explicit or implicit beliefs. There's no human being who doesn't believe something. Maybe it's not as explicit for them, maybe it's more tacit, but they believe something. But that also makes us dangerous. And in the Christian tradition, we've seen how that could be corrupted by sin and could lead in a negative way. But you can start to see why that imagination could occur, to try to just worry about being a good kid. But of course, the question is, Larry and I were talking about this, where does good come from? And where does that stand? And good hasn't, if you look across human history, hasn't always been defined as the same thing. And sometimes our good gets co-opted by kind of middle-class norms. Sometimes good could get co-opted by, I mean, you could be a Nietzschean, and good is the power to take what's yours. Good is the power to defeat the weak. And it's a very different Christian narrative of what is good. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first, that those who are in need of assistance and help should receive that. It's a very different kind of moral category. So her daughter, whether she wants her to believe something or not, will have to believe something to act in the good way she wants her to. But again, we're talking about imagination here, and how she can just in an imaginative frame think, well, it's not what she believes that matters, it's what she does that matters. It's very interesting to imagine that, to have that kind of imagination. Maybe yeah, please. Yeah, no, that's well said. And so we really need to look at ourselves as much as look at her. And what she presumes belief is, she doesn't get in a vacuum either. And she gets it probably from some, I don't think inside, but probably from the outside, looking at religious communities, probably particularly Christian communities, and belief becomes very much a list of propositions you believe, or a way not to kind of, as Anselm says, faith-seeking understanding. There isn't really a wrestling. There is a just, oh, I believe it. If that's what my pastor says, that's what I believe. If that's what the Bible says, that's what I believe. There's not a critical kind of engagement. There's not a reflection. There's not a wrestling. So it's not, she's fairly has seen people who say belief is everything not actually wrestle with even deep kind of moral, ethical forms of how to act in the world, as well as larger ones like what is reality. Yeah. Any last word? We're about ready for a break. Yep.
It seems like her core belief is tolerance.
Yeah.
Because that kind of is the bedrock belief for her.
Right.
She doesn't want her child to be negative.
Right. Yeah. And it would be a question. I mean, we would be really annoying people to have coffee with, or, like she wouldn't want to hang out with us. But the question would be like, well, where does tolerance come from? Like, why is that good? And I guess this is kind of connecting your points, that there's no way to think about this outside of some kind of tradition. So she's taking some kind of tradition that maybe she hasn't thought about, but she's bringing that to bear here. And the question is this a good tradition that's given us good moral forms, or has this been a way of bending the tradition in a negative way to justify really abusive actions? But when she says tolerance is a good, that doesn't just come from nowhere. It comes from some tradition she has. But again, tolerance seems to be something that doesn't need any forms of belief. Now, what I want to, this is like the TV show Next Week On. So we're going to take a break, and I'm trying to, here's what we're going to start building here as we go. Is just how the idea that you could separate what you believe and what you do, that there could be, however we think she can't really accomplish it. I think it's fair to say she can't accomplish it, but in her imagination, there is a big space between what you do and what you believe. In the imagination of people in the West, and by the West, I just mean those who are the leftovers of Latin Christendom. So those of us who come from the Western Church, which takes us into South America and takes us into, around the Atlantic axis and things like that. But when we think of those of us who have some kind of heritage in Western Christianity, there was a sense not long ago that you could never separate belief in action. These things were so deeply infused, you didn't know where one began and the other left. Part of what I mean by what it means to live in a secular age is these things start to separate.